Hello, Music 25 students. This is Profe bringing you Module 2. This is the first of two modules that will be highlighting the music of Cuba. For this module, we'll be looking at two basic parts. The first part is on folklore, or folkloric music, and the second part is on popular music up to the revolution. So, a reminder, when we say folk music, what do we mean? Folklore is made by the people, for their own enjoyment. Whereas popular music usually refers to musicians getting paid, musicians maybe studying, and the fact that music is then widely disseminated, let's say by radio or recordings. So folk music is going to be the subject of the first part of this module, and specifically musical traditions of African origin. As a reminder, what we learned in Module 1, the main tribes, the three main tribes brought from West Africa to Cuba were the Yoruba, the Congo or Congolese, and the Dahomey. These are referred to as Lukumi, Bantu, and Arara in Cuba. And how did slaves live in Cuba? They lived on plantation barrack systems, and they were allowed maybe one day a week to preserve a lot of their traditions, drumming, singing, and dancing. So this was a really important part of why the musical traditions from West Africa are preserved so well in Cuba. The way that this was done was that the Africans formed these mutual aid societies called cabildos. A cabildo is like all at once a church and a community organization, and it's a support system, a very important support system to help people preserve their traditions, and in particular pass on their languages, their religion, and their drumming. We're going to start with, again, sacred music. So these are musical traditions associated with different African religions. I'm going to start us off by listening to the bata drums. The bata developed in Nigeria. They're used in a ceremonial context, in the context of religion known as regla de ocha, sometimes referred to as santeria. These drums originated in Nigeria, but in Cuba wound up in this set of three that you see at the top right of your screen. I'm going to play you the sound of the bata drums playing these very complex polyrhythms. These are all religious or sacred rhythms. What is so important to understand is that those rhythms represent a form of communication. The drums are actually speaking, and so that's a very important part of West African musical traditions in general, that the instruments are sometimes substitutes for the spoken word or the spoken language. So you just heard the drums there. Now we're going to hear the drums accompanied by singing. So these are like praise songs or prayers that would typically be done in a religious ceremony. The only difference is that we're hearing a professional recording made by, in this case, the National Folklore Company of Cuba, the Conjunto Folclórico Nacional de Cuba. This is where I studied, and it's a really important group because they were established after the revolution in Cuba to preserve a lot of these traditions that had normally been preserved by families for hundreds of years. Suddenly now people can study these art forms. So we're going to hear now a praise song to Elegua, the deity. Agoy bara, bakutelegba, orokumayo. Ijabara lagiki, orokumayo. Para la guana, orokumayo. Hopefully you were able to notice some of those Africanisms that we've been talking about. Call and response, repetition, polyrhythm, and improvisation. Of course, there's always improvisation in this music. And as I mentioned, syncopation, which is definitely a part of almost all music in the world. So these are very important musical elements that we find in the folkloric traditions of West Africa, and those traditions transplanted into Cuba. So what we just heard were two examples of this Yoruba music that is preserved in Cuba. Now we're going to see a group that represents a lot of these traditions in a performance setting. So you're going to see, actually this image is of 3 bata drummers. Each drummer holds 1 drum, and then you have the choir behind. And then in the front, as you'll see in this video, are people dancing and dressed in costumes that represent the different deities, or what we call the orishas, in the Regla de Ocha tradition. This is a spiritual practice that combines elements of Yoruban religion with Catholicism. So it's what we call syncretism, or religious syncretism. And here you are going to be seeing a sort of a story that is being told through dance and music. The language is Yoruba, as spoken or sung in Cuba. And this is a performing group that is sponsored by the state to perform and record and tour around the world. This is a group called Yoruba Andabo. Baba Yongo Dara Obala Ese Obala Ese Baba Fumila Ye Akete Oba Oba Eniye Ekweye Ule Akete Oba Oba Eniye Baba Yongo Dara Obala Ese Obala Ese Baba Fumila Ye. So these are stories, like mythologies, and it's very similar to a lot of other polytheistic traditions, religious traditions where there's a belief in many gods. So in addition to the Yoruba culture in Cuba, you also have the Bantu or Congolese traditions, as well as the Dahomean traditions. They all have their own drums, their own songs, different languages and dances, and this is an important part of the legacy of African rituals in Cuba, still preserved after hundreds of years. One of the most interesting traditions is called Abakwa. The Abakwa was a secret male sect of Efik origin from the Calabar area in Nigeria, and of all the places where West Africans were captured and taken, Cuba was the only place where this manifested itself. So it's a very unique tradition. They have their own drums, very interesting ceremonies. It's typically a male-only society, and they have these very mystical beings called iremes. The one you see on the bottom right of your screen is an ireme. And the dancing is very distinct, and the movements that you see are supposed to represent elements of nature. And these dances have been around for hundreds of years, and they're very influential in the popular art forms as well. So I'm going to show you a little video of a group called Echua Laboni. They are a youth ensemble, so mostly these are teenagers. And this is an open, like an area outside where they rehearse and hang out and have jam sessions. This is an example of an Abakwa dance. Once again, we're hearing all of those musical Africanisms, right? Call and response, repetition, polyrhythm, improvisation, syncopation. They're all present. And, you know, this is definitely an example of the miracle, if you will, of preservation, considering that all these art forms developed during the colonial era when people were enslaved. The fact that not only were these art forms preserved, but now they're shared and spread with people throughout the community. And so, you know, Cuba is a very multiracial, multi-ethnic society, and you can see these traditions being shared with people of all races in Cuba. What we just saw and heard were examples of sacred music and dance. Now we're going to talk about some of the secular traditions of folk music in Cuba, starting off with the Carnaval tradition, or the what most people around the world call carnival. There's a whole unit on carnival that we're going to be talking about as well in different places around the world. And then we'll talk about rumba. And rumba is one of the most important ancestors of a lot of the popular music today. So we're going to end this particular part of the module with rumba. Starting off, again, the conga is the name of an instrument, but it's also the name of a musical style and dance that developed within the tradition of carnival in Cuba. This goes back to the colonial era, when cabildos, those mutual aid societies, were allowed to once a year have these demonstrations and these parades with costumes and drums and singing. And over time, that tradition that was really West African combined with Holy Week in the Spanish Catholic tradition, and that is the result of what we see in Carnaval. The groups themselves are called comparsas. So in Cuba, a carnival group is called a comparsa. And there are two different styles of music that developed in the conga tradition. One is called habanera because it was created in Havana, and the other is santiaguera because it was created in Santiago de Cuba, the easternmost city in Cuba. The style from Santiago features a very interesting instrument that is Chinese. Hopefully in your reading you saw that there were over 200,000 people from China brought to work in Cuba during the colonial era. And this is the instrument that you're going to see at the bottom, the trompeta china, which in Spanish means Chinese trumpet. In Chinese, it's called a suona. It's a very high-pitched, kind of a squealy sound that is commonly found not only in Asia, but also in Africa. And you're going to hear it accompanied by many, many different drums. This is an example of the conga santiaguera. So again, a very distinct sounding instrument, right? The style of Carnaval in Havana is a little bit different. Instead of that Asian instrument, they use a regular trumpet or multiple trumpets, as well as many different types of drums. And when you hear and see this music, it's very exciting. The lyric says in Spanish, "Siento un bombo, mamita me está llamando." I feel a drum calling me. And that is a really important part, of course, of the music, the drumming, right? And everybody moving together in rhythm with the drum. So now I'm going to show you a little short clip of the Carnaval in Santiago. You can see lots of different types of music and dancing and instruments. And you'll start off by seeing a Chinese dragon. So again, understanding that the Chinese influence is very significant in Cuba. You can always tell the tourists. So I encourage you to see as many of the different videos that you can on our Cuba playlist on YouTube. There's so many different amazing ones. All right, so rumba. We're going to end this part of this slideshow with the most important form of secular folkloric traditions that was developed in Cuba, specifically in the city of Matanzas in the late 1800s. Rumba is a genre. In other words, it is not just one kind of music. It has multiple styles within it, but it's a very distinctly Cuban tradition that developed as a result of the influence of West Central African music and Spanish flamenco. So you hear mostly Bantu or Congolese influences blending with Spanish flamenco. Typically, this music is played on percussion instruments. And again, what is a percussion instrument? It is a box or a drum or a bell or a pair of sticks or something that you shake. And in this case, originally, rumba was played on cajones, on box drums, and later the tumbadoras, which is the fancy name for conga drums. Eventually, they would add other types of instruments, such as the kata, which is a piece of bamboo, a couple of sticks playing that, and maybe a metal shaker, or even a couple of spoons hitting a wooden box. But probably one of the most important instruments in all of Cuban music are the claves. They're very simple, two sticks that are struck together. So we refer to it as claves, plural, when it's the instrument, and clave, singular, when it's the rhythm that is being played by the instrument. And the rhythm itself is a 5-note repeated pattern that is at the heart of almost all Cuban music. It's also the heartbeat of salsa. Tumbadoras, or the conga drums, are the instrument that was developed in Cuba as a result of these earlier African influences and instruments, and over time developed into the types of drums that you see here. They're tuned with metal hardware, and they're different widths, and they have different pitches. So these are the drums that you hear not only in rumba, but in all Cuban music, and of course, in salsa. So now we're going to hear a couple of different examples of the different styles of rumba. There are three main styles: yambu, which is the oldest and slowest; guaguancó, which is the medium tempo and most popularly played; and the columbia, which is pretty fast. So this first example is a yambu. So what you just heard there were just voices and percussion instruments. That style of singing is called scatting. In Spanish we say tararear. When you're not saying words, you're just saying syllables and sounds. And that's a really important part of this music, because you don't have any other instruments in there like trumpets or flutes or guitars to give everybody the same note or the same key. So the voice is actually the thing that helps everybody stay in the same key. We're going to see now a little video clip of some people playing a yambu in their backyard. Doesn't it look like they're having a lot of fun? And if you notice, one of the instruments there were a couple of spoons banging on a wooden box. So the whole aspect of rumba is that you play whatever you have available, right? You don't even necessarily have to have an instrument. You can bang on a table or a chair, on a door, and you can create music. You can pull out a couple of spoons out of your kitchen drawer. That is the whole essence of rumba. It is very improvisational. It is a community experience, and people of all ages and all races participate in rumba, although of course it is a black art form. It developed of African influence with the influence of Spanish flamenco. Now we're going to hear a style called guaguancó. This is a little bit faster in tempo. And you'll notice every time you hear a rumba song, the very first sound you hear are the claves that start it off. Again, the importance of the tarareo, or what we call in Cuba the diana, to get the musicians in tune. So those singers were singing together in harmony, but they weren't singing any words. They were just singing at the syllables and the sounds and the melody of the song. Now we're going to see some dancing. We're going to see some guaguancó dancing in the city of Havana. This is from the documentary series Roots of Rhythm that you've hopefully already seen a few clips of. Here is a great scene.
In the cities of Cuba, the mingling of rural and urban people over time has produced a steady flow of raw creativity and musical innovation. These communities are the wellsprings of the popular dances that have swept far beyond the shores of this island. The mambo, the conga, the cha-cha-cha, the rumba. Originally, they were all created here in these streets.
And we're going to see another example by one of the most significant groups that developed this art form, a group called Los Muñequitos de Matanzas. Again, the city of Matanzas is about an hour east of Havana, and this is where rumba was developed and created. This is from a performance in the United States in 1992. You're going to see the part of the song that already gets to the call and response part when the dancing begins. Here's a little example. You might be curious what those movements represent. We're going to talk a lot about that, but that movement is called vacunao. Vacuna in Spanish means vaccine. So if you can imagine, in this movement, the male is trying to vaccinate the female, and she's trying not to get vaccinated. So of course, this is a really important part of African dance aesthetics, the idea that as sexual beings, we're trying to demonstrate and manifest some of those elements as well. Here's another example of people just having a jam session, again in a style called wawanko. You notice that little boy on the right who was barely tall enough to be able to reach the top cowbell, and he was keeping perfect time. So the idea that this is intergenerational, I think, is really, really important. This group, Los Muñequitos de Matanzas, that we had seen before, we're going to see them again. They are one of the most important ambassadors of this art form. They started together in 1952. And they're still together, and there are multiple generations in this group. This is another segment from the Roots of Rhythm documentary series where they talk specifically about this style of rumba called Columbia.
We are at a neighborhood jam session with the Muñequitos in the city of Matanzas. At first glance, deceptively simple. In fact, this is a symphony of extremely sophisticated rhythms. Rhythms that originated in the streets and the fields. African rhythms that survived slavery and colonialism. Rhythms that went on to become the dominant force in Cuban music.
And as I mentioned, one of the most important things that had happened after the revolution in Cuba was the establishment of schools and academies where you could study Cuban music. Up until that point, this was all just done in the family. This was done, again, as a folkloric tradition made by the people for their own enjoyment. And after the revolution, it was important to document that this was an art form, or there were many art forms that people, not only in Cuba, wanted to study, but people around the world. This particular video you're going to see is actually the school where I studied. This is, again, the National Folkloric Company School in Havana. And here's, again, a neighborhood jam session, and you're going to see a young man dancing Columbia. The movements are incredibly African, of course. There might be singing in Spanish, but for the most part, when you see and experience rumba, it's like 90% African. And of course, the younger start you get, the better. And so I think what's really inspiring about how folkloric traditions in Cuba have been preserved is that they are passed on. They are shared by all generations of people, and this is what keeps it going. And even though, yes, you could technically go study this in school, there's no substitute for having it in your family and in everyday life. So here's our final little clip on this video, this module. So I really want to emphasize the importance of the intergenerational aspect. Folkloric music really only works when people keep passing it on, right? Otherwise, it goes into obscurity or it completely fades away. And that is what's so remarkable. These are traditions that have been around since the colonial era, since the 1800s, and people in Cuba are still developing them today. So as we continue to understand and unpack this amazing music and dance, you're going to learn that not only is the imprint of Africa and Spain an important part of the music, but the ongoing evolution, the influences from other places and other generations coming into the music are equally important. So now we're going to move on to our next part of this second module. See you soon.